funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
As a youngster going to school in a Thai town in County Clare during the 1970s and 80s, I learned all about the Great Irish Famine of 1845 to 1850 and how it killed over 1 million Irish people and destroyed communities throughout the country. However, in all my schooling, never once was there any mention of how the famine affected a Thai town itself. To find out more, I recently met up with a Thai local historian, Frank Taff.
Here in Athy, over 1,200 people died on our local workhouse during the famine years. And the population of the town itself, fell by another 1,000, So over 2,000 people died during the famine. Not all of the famine, but I'd say mostly, the vast majority of those people died because of famine conditions.
By 1849, over 4 years into the famine, a Thai workhouse was engulfed by hordes of famine victims seeking help.
The highest number recorded in the workhouse was in June 1849, when there was 1,528 inmates in the workhouse. The original workhouse had been built to accommodate 600. Obviously couldn't care for that amount, so they opened 2 supplementary workhouses, one in Barrack Street and one at the Canal Store. So you had the principal workhouse and 2 minor workhouses accommodating 1,528 people in June 1849.
And what about the other County Clare workhouses in Naas and Selbridge?
It was a similar case in Naas and in Selbridge, because the entire country was hit very badly during the famine.
And similar to County Kildare, most 130 or so workhouses throughout Ireland were overwhelmed by the famine, some to a chronic degree. Jerry Moran, Research Fellow at the Social Science Research Centre in NUI Galway, explains what occurred in Galway Workhouse.
You have workhouses like Galway, which by 1848 have nearly 5,000 paupers living inside, even though they were originally only built for 1,000. And there are reports in 1849, 1850 where you have 4 and 5 people sleep into a bed because of the lack of accommodation.
And of the thousands of Irish workhouse inmates, over 3/4 were female, in particular orphan girls. Jerry Moore.
3/4 of the able-bodied in the workhouses by 1849, 1850 are women. You have about 120,000 children, many of them classified as orphans, which was not entirely true, but many of them had been put in there. A parent may have died, or else very often a parent emigrates, and it becomes largely a safety net for women and for children. But the problem it creates for the authorities, what are you going to do with these? Because they will remain a long-term burden.
And it was in an attempt to try rectify this problem that Lord Earl Grey in the British government came up with a possible solution. Dr. Perry McIntyre, chair of the Great Irish Famine Commemorative Committee in Sydney, Australia.
Earl Grey was the minister, in modern terms, for immigration in the London office. And there was a scheme that he and Australians had devised that would relieve some of the distress in the workhouses because they were so overcrowded because of the famine. But also Australia needed single, young, respectable girls as marriage partners and domestic servants, because so many more men had been transported to Australia than women, that there was a real shortage of good women, if you like. And so they thought together between them that this would alleviate problems on both sides of the world.
There was an element of push and pull about it, if you understand what I mean. The push would have come, yes, from the workhouses, the conditions there in wanting to, they were overcrowded, and obviously it was to the advantage of the authorities to ship out a certain number of girls to Australia. But there was an element of pull too from the Australian end, from the colonies, where there was a surplus of males in the colony Therefore, it suited the authorities in Australia to bring out girls to redress some of the imbalance.
Dr. Daniel Cusack, Irish-Australian historian and author of the book The Great Famine in County Meath. And now that the Australian colonial authorities had agreed to fund a workhouse orphan emigration scheme, what occurred next? Jerry Moran.
A circular is sent round in February of 1848 asking the workhouses to select suitable candidates that will be interviewed. And you can see in March of 1848 that the authorities in Ireland are now looking frantically for the girls that can be sent out. In March of 1848 in Nina Workhouse, you have 300 girls who are earmarked to be sent out, and most of the other workhouses a similar pattern emerges.
So what criteria did the workhouse guardians use to vet applicants? Frank Taff.
And they were looking for girls that were healthy, able-bodied, might have some amount of education and might make good domestic servants when they got to Australia.
They would have insisted that these girls must come from among the most healthy, the most confident. You know, they'd be looking for all those qualities that we'd expect them to be looking for.
Richard Reid, historian from Canberra in Australia and author of the book Farewell My Children, Irish Assisted Emigration to Australia, 1848 to 1870.
They certainly, you know, they're medically inspected. So I suspect that girls who were, you know, sadly, you know, who were emaciated, who obviously would not have been able to withstand a voyage like that, you know, any medical problems whatsoever, would have been rejected.
Well, in theory, they had to be orphaned. Now, in 19th century terms, orphan meant one parent dead, not like we would have both parents dead. In some cases, these girls did have parents alive. They were simply there because they were destitute. And so it was about picking people who were able to go and willing to go. And I have found some instances in the Poor Law Union minute books where there was apparently a form that they had to sign to consent that they would go. So it's not this shipping them out, they're not transported, they're not coerced or forced. They actually agreed to go once they had a health check and were considered suitable immigrants.
And just how eager were the workhouse girls to go? Dr. Perry McIntyre.
The biggest thing is how desperate were they to be in the workhouse in the first place. Because apparently, and that's talked about by historians and the general Irish public now, the shame it was to admit that you were so poor and so destitute that you had to rely on government relief and go to the workhouse. So that was the first level of shame, if you like.
Well, of course, that was the height of the Great Famine, you know, and a lot of these girls would have been come from families of cottiers, very small farmers, agricultural labourers. The workhouse basically was an ultimate refuge if they couldn't feed themselves in their home place. So it was kind of a last resort in many cases.
Historian Danny Cusack. And stuck as thousands of workhouse girls were in the last resort workhouse system, there was no lack of applicants. Jerry Moran.
Undoubtedly, the demand is greater than the supply because, if you look in terms of, with the Nina Workhouse, the fact that, you have 300 applicants and only 50 of them are sent out.
We do have evidence from Tipperary of girls who deliberately had come into workhouses to try and become selected for this scheme.
Historian Richard Reid.
So we do have a bit of evidence about that because the Guardians posted a notice saying that no more young women will be accepted trying to come into the workhouse solely to get a passage to go to Australia. So we know that they were keen enough to do that. So if we take that as kind of probably something that was right round the country when that offer was sort of made, I suspect that there was no shortage of volunteers among the young women. Why would there be?
The demand to leave, and you can understand why, because if you're a girl, 14, 15, in the workhouse. And if you are an orphan, the chances of a life outside of the workhouse is very, very remote. So for many of them, it is an opportunity to better themselves.
From the workhouse to Australia, a new life began. Taken from starvation by the bold Earl Grey plan. A brighter day beckoned across the far sea. The workhouse girls hoped for a life to be free.
And after each participating workhouse had picked their girls, the next step was for each workhouse to contact the landed immigration commissioners who oversaw the scheme. Richard Reid.
The workhouses would then write back to the commissioners saying, we have picked, say it's Castlebar Workhouse, we have got 35 young women we think would be ideal. And what they then do is a guy called Lieutenant Henry, who's the agent of a group in England known as the Land and Immigration Commissioners. They're public servants whose job it is to oversee the Australian assisted emigration paid for by the Australian governments. He would go down to Castlebar. He would see these women, he would look at them, he'd say, no, well, Mary Ryan there is fine, but I won't take Mary Byrne because she's a bit young and, etc., for whatever reason. So he would select the ones from the selected ones that he thought ought to go. And then the poor law guardians would be responsible for equipping them with a box of clothing, of decent clothing.
And it's important to stress that while the Australian colonial authorities were bankrolling all the costs of the voyage from England to Australia, it was the poor law guardians in each participating workhouse who had to pay for their own girls' clothing, subsistence and travel expenses from their workhouse to Plymouth in England. Ultimately, it was usually the local landowners, whose rates funded the workhouse in the first place, who footed this bill. Frank Taft divulges the Athy workhouse experience.
We have a description of a meeting which was held in Narramore, a meeting held to advise the local people of what was intended. And the idea was to get agreement of the local landlords, essentially, to be able to finance, because they had to pay for the kitting out of the young girls to go, and also they would get assisted passage, but they had to pay. They were each provided with a trunk, with clothing, etc., and all the essentials required when they got to Australia.
The passage, these girls went totally free to themselves. So the poor law guardians actually paid for them to have an outfit. Each girl had a box with a certain amount of dresses, bonnets, petticoats, shoes, the whole bit in the box, needles, sewing, cotton, thread, and it was all listed out on the lid. Their names were painted on the side of the box, and possibly for many of these girls, for the first time in their lives, they had a kit of clothes that was their personal clothes. So, maybe that was a lure for some of them too.
From the workhouse to Australia, a new life began. Taken from starvation by the bold Earl Grey plan. New clothes were arranged for the orphans to wear. A travel box given and a comb for their hair.
A total of 37 girls were sent out from the Athy workhouse. From Selbridge there were 8 girls, and from Naas 15 girls. Of the 37 girls, I've identified 35 of them. There's 2 I just cannot identify at this point in time. They were all, with one exception, they were all Roman Catholics, all ranged in age from 15 to 19 years of age. And there was one Church of Ireland girl, and Ellen Murray, who was 18, whose mother was still living in Athy, but her father obviously had died or had emigrated, and she was part of the orphan emigration scheme sent out to Australia.
And those County Clare orphan girls that Frank Taft just mentioned were part of the total figure of 4,114 girls who participated in the Earl Grey orphan scheme from Ireland to Australia during the 2-year period 1848 to 1850. Perry McIntyre.
And the hardest part of the voyage was all these ships to Australia under this scheme sailed from Plymouth. So the girls had to get across the Irish Sea to Plymouth. And you see money being paid by the Workhouse, by the Poor Law Commissioners, to Paul Wright for boxes to be made for 30 girls. Someone else, the carriage of them on a cart to the nearest railway station, perhaps, and then the passage on the train to perhaps Dublin, and then the passage across the Irish Sea to Plymouth.
And the first batch of 18 orphan girls to leave a Thai workhouse had to travel by train and steamship to catch their ship in Plymouth. Frank Taff.
The first lot went across on the Lady Peel, the ship Lady Peel, arrived in Sydney in July 1849. So they would have set out from Athy, presumably would have travelled to Dublin by train. The first train, Great Southern Western Railway, had been extended to Carlow in 1846. So just 3 years, I assume, for a lot of those, for all of those girls, in fact, the first time to travel on a train would have been to Dublin. And from there, they would have left from the dock in Dublin, would have travelled to Plymouth, a trip of 36 hours on an open-deck steamer. A very difficult trip, I understand. And they would have then arrived at what was a place called Baltic Wharf in Plymouth. And there they would have waited until the ship which had brought them to Australia was ready to go. It would take approximately 99 days or almost 3 months to arrive in Australia. But all did arrive safely.
So what would the typical ship voyage from England to Australia have been like? Historian Richard Reid.
If we travel to Australia now, right, you get on a 777-300ER or whatever it is, or an Airbus 380, and you're there within 21 hours, All right, you travel cattle class, but you can inoculate yourself with gin and tonic and whatever's your poison, and it's nothing. Nothing. These girls had to sit on a ship or be on a ship for 3 months, from Plymouth through the North Atlantic, through the equatorial zones, down to the South Atlantic, turning left at the Cape of Good Hope, all the way across the roaring 40s, with mountainous seas in places, Yeah, that would have been an experience that very few of us, would want to have on a journey like that. We wouldn't have liked it. It would be confined spaces. The food would have been adequate but monotonous. Days would have been fairly monotonous. They did have a schoolmaster on board, and they were taught. If they wished to learn, they could pretty much basic reading, writing and arithmetic sort of stuff, but nonetheless that facility was there for them. But yes, there's 3 months of not a lot to do and in a fairly confined space, and at times with storms and at sea, which the seamen know all about and they're used to that, but you wouldn't be. Young girl from the Midlands of Ireland, to be taken out of that and suddenly to be in a gale in the roaring 40s heading from Cape of Good Hope across to New South Wales, that would have been something to experience. But that's what you went through in those days. I'm not saying they were any different to us, but that was what you just had to accept in order to get there.
Many of them from inland areas in Ireland would never have seen the sea, let alone contemplate a 3 months voyage on a ship. So I think they were very brave.
It is an extraordinary trip, and you can well imagine for young country girls who had lived for some months, maybe even for years in a workhouse, and had no contact with people outside of the workhouse population, what it must have felt to have even travelled to Dublin on a train, then by boat to Plymouth and then to Australia, to a new environment completely alien to them. It was quite an extraordinary trip.
Each ship had a surgeon superintendent who was really in charge. The captain wasn't so in charge. The surgeon superintendent was in charge. And he regulated the whole ship and how the girls were looked after, and that they had to be locked away from the boys of the crew and all that sort of thing, and had to behave.
And the surgeon superintendent on one ship called the Thomas Arbuthnot, which sailed in 1850, was Surgeon Charles Strutt. Historian Perry McIntyre.
The surgeon superintendent on the Thomas Arbuthnot, which was one of these ships, and he wrote a diary on the Thomas Arbuthnot about the girls and how good they were, and how he fed them plum pudding on Christmas Day, and how when they got to Sydney he talked about the fatness of his girls. So they'd been well fed on the voyage.
From the time that they actually arrive, all of them get employment very, very quick, because in essence what happens is they are going out to be employed.
Historian Jerry Morn.
We have a list of 62 girls who leave on the Lady Canaway from Sligo in 1849 and who go to Melbourne. And we know 2 years later everything about them. We know where they're living, we know who they're employed by, and most of them are employed as domestic servants or as nannies, looking after their children. But we also know the wages. The wages are about £10 a year for board, but they're also under contracts, because the authorities do insist that they are provided with a contract for a period of time.
And for those orphan girls who arrived into Sydney, their first accommodation in the city was the old Hyde Park Barracks. Frank Taff.
When they arrived, they would have been accommodated in an old convict barracks in Sydney, the Hyde Park Barracks, and they were being kept there for maybe a month or two until such time as they were apprenticed out or indentured out to some local farmers or whatever it is as a domestic servants. And generally speaking, they would have been contracted out for a year, 2 years or 3 years. And thereafter they may have been free to get married.
If we look at the subsequent history of the lot of girls who did go to Australia, we find that within a year or 2 years at most, they're married, they're out working on farms. And again, we have to emphasise this isn't necessarily true of all girls, but it seems that a majority of them did well for themselves in their new country.
Danny Cusack. Here's historian Richard Reid.
We have a big study ahead of us to look at, how well did they do, by comparison with other groups in the colony and everything else. My gut feeling is that it would be like the old statistical bell curve. There'd be those who really had an awful time, there'd be an average, and then there'd be a few who did extremely well. We know of one girl who came back to Ireland, in the 1890s to visit her relatives in Galway. And we have the diary that she kept of going around and staying with people. Well, she'd obviously done well enough. She goes back to Australia, so she has enough money to come all the way back to Ireland and go all the way back to Australia again, so most of them wouldn't have done that. That's not typical by any means. But there you are. There's an ongoing story of these people. We forget that because we see them always in terms of the hell of the famine, and we forget that those who survive and go on and go somewhere else live on until, till 1910, 1920. Ned Kelly's mother came out in 1841, a bit before this. She died in her 90s, in the 1920s in Australia.
There's one girl that goes out in the Earl Grey, one of the first ones, from Belfast.
Historian Jerry Morn.
And, we know that, by the 1870s, she has married, is doing very well. The family have one of the most important restaurants in Sydney. And when she dies, she leaves a reasonably large fortune to her children. Now, there are cases like that where individuals have done extremely well for themselves.
In 1849, at the age of 15, Eliza White left Naas Workhouse in County Kildare on the orphan-assisted emigration scheme. She travelled from Naas to Plymouth in England, where she caught the ship to Australia, arriving in Sydney in November 1849. After 98 days in Sydney's Hyde Park Barracks, she was employed by a Mr. E. Dunn of Double Bay, Sydney, for 2 years at £7 for the first year and £8 for her second year of employment. A few years later, in 1857, she married John Brown, who was a gardener. They had 7 children, including twins who died in infancy. In 1877, the family moved to a 2-storey weatherboard cottage at Rushcutters Bay in Sydney. A grandson, George, remembered visiting the family as a child. His grandmother always cooked a leg of mutton and rice pudding. Eliza attended Catholic Mass until the last days of her life. She eventually died, aged 84, on the 16th day of July, 1918.
Anne Bowen from a workhouse in Galway was transferred to New South Wales, and she married actually a man called Cusack from Roscommon, which is my surname. No connection, because all my Cusack relations who emigrated to Western Australia were from County Meath. But a son of theirs, Jack Cusack, subsequently became Mayor of Yass, which is a large country town in New South Wales outside Canberra, a prominent state politician, and then briefly, during the Great Depression, a member of the Federal House of Representatives, and was something of a rough dime and a bit of a maverick, a bit of a colourful character in his own right, ran a coach building business, and his children, notably Greg Cusack, founded what's well known in Canberra today, Cusack Motors, which is still a going business concern. So again, that's a direct descendant, I suppose, of Anne Bowen, this orphan girl from County Galway. Not known in her own right, but perhaps, I suppose, notable for her son and then subsequent generations of Cusacks, particularly in Canberra and that part of Australia.
Historian Danny Cusack. And as was touched on earlier, while the vast majority of orphan girls found work, married and succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, nevertheless there were a few such as Bridget Higney, who fell by the wayside and found tragedy. Perry McIntyre.
Bridget Higney, what we know about her is from a newspaper report where after she's been in Australia for, I think it's 3 or 4 years, she gives birth to a child, obviously illegitimately. There's never a mention of a husband or anything. And she's obviously unable to cope. And that child ends up in a benevolent asylum where it's looked after. And perhaps she is one of the ones who is, mentally unable to cope. There's no mention that she's drinking, but quite a number of them did revert to drink and ended up in institutions. Sadly, given they left an institution here in Ireland, that they end up in a very similar big grey place to what they left. So they're the ones that don't perhaps fulfil the dream, if you like. And when we do the full story of this, we'll be able to tell you how many of those there are. And there are some of those sad stories, of course.
However, thankfully Bridget Higney's story was the exception rather than the norm, since the majority of orphan girls found prosperity and also happiness through family and community. Also, some of their descendants achieved major prominence in later Australian society. Jerry Moran.
If you look at some of the descendants of these girls are people like Thomas Keneally, the playwright, and a novelist. Another one, a descendant of these, is Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia. So they're a very important grouping, and they do fill a need which the colony needs at that particular time. It also provides an opportunity for the siblings of these, because there are instances in the records which show that these girls, they don't forget their families that were left, some of them even in the workhouses. The fact that they're sending money back so that brothers can join them, I think it is a testimony to how important family was to them, even though the vast majority of them were orphans.
Actually, one of those girls on the Thomas Arbuthnot, she marries a man called Hart, and her son is a guy called Steve Hart, who's one of the Kelly gang. So there you've got the old Irish thing.
Ned Kelly's accomplice.
You've got one of Ned Kelly's four of the Kelly gang. He's one of them, Steve Hart. So you find stories like that all over the place of these girls who are marrying, and different stories come out about what happens to them and who they are.
historian Richard Reid. Here is Margaret Hogan of Birr Historical Society.
There are wonderful stories, two that I can think of. One of them married a convict who had been transported from Tipperary, but he ended up as a police constable. The other married an English man. He did fairly well in business. They bought a kind of a pub type place near gold diggings. And they, a bush ranger, one of these bush rangers, right, he was shot dead near them, and the inquest was held in their inn. So our descendant, Russell Blanche, has written a book about this.
So I think, all in all, looking at it in hindsight, it seems to have been an excellent scheme which would have given all of these girls a wonderful opportunity which they would never, ever have had in this country, living in, as they were, in workhouses.
It does provide them with an opportunity they would never have had at home. For the Australians, they do get some very, very good individuals, who do progress in life and do make a life for themselves.
However, despite all these positives, nevertheless, in 1850, the orphan emigration scheme was abruptly stopped. Richard Reid.
The Thomas Arbuthnot was one of the last ships of this Earl Grey scheme. Now, I can't remember the total number of ships, but there's 4,114 young Irish women who go out on this scheme between 1848 and mid-1850. The Thomas Arbuthnot comes about March 1850, so it's among the last. Anyhow, by the time the Thomas Arbuthnot gets there, the colonial feeling and mood is that they do not want workhouse people coming. It was more about the fact that here is Britain and Ireland deciding that they will get rid of their most destitute, most people in most want as emigrants. Now, of course, that would have been easy to do that, to fill ships with those sort of people. But the colonial authorities and the colonial settlers are saying, we don't want that. What we want are people who want to come to Australia, who are the best kind, if you like, of the quote-unquote working classes of Britain and Ireland and Scotland and so on, England, Ireland and Scotland. So, the Arbuthnot arrives, and it arrives in that climate that there's been a lot of building up over a couple of years, a lot of antipathy to this whole scheme.
What you have to remember is that in Australia at this particular time, there was a sizable anti-Catholic grouping. About 2/3 of the population of Australia in the 1840s were Protestants.
Historian Jerry Morn.
There were groups who were very evangelical, and they were very much anti-Catholic in their approach. Now, from the time that the first group go out on the Lady Grey, there's opposition that these are Catholic paupers, but over half of them were Protestants. So that it was really equating every Irish person as being a Catholic. Now, in 1850, there was a groundswell, in particular in the media and the Protestant media, to stop this. There were complaints in relation to that they were Catholic, but there were also complaints that the girls weren't fit for the jobs that they were coming out to, which subsequently was discovered to have been totally untrue. So it was as a result of this opposition within Australia that the schemes abruptly come to an end after the 4,114 girls have been sent out.
And by the time the scheme ended, over 4,000 Irish workhouse girls had participated in it. So does history view the scheme as a success? Frank Taff.
It would be regarded as a success in terms of the opportunities it gave to the 4,000 odd girls that left. But in terms of the attempts to rid the Irish workhouses of the excessive numbers of children, bear in mind there was 55,000 children under 18 years of age in the workhouses at that time. So only a little over 4,000 were taken away. So it wasn't a success in that regard.
Overall, I suppose it wasn't. It didn't have a huge impact. You were talking maybe about 100 or 110 or 120 girls, maybe from Kerry, I know, and maybe the same from other counties. So that it didn't make a huge difference in the context of relief or alleviating hardship or that. But as I say, for individuals involved, a great opportunity.
North Kerry historian Brian McMahon. Here's Birr local historian Margaret Hogan.
This was one good thing that the government in England did, because generally they weren't at all generous to the Irish poor. But this was really organised from London, and I suppose it was organised really to bring women to Australia where there was a shortage of women. But the girls really would have done better in Australia than they would have done in Ireland at the time.
From hunger and torment and famine's dark cloud, from the workhouse to Australia to live and be proud. 4,000 girls travelled to Australia's far shore, with the Earl Grey scheme's blessing to prosperity's door.
I think it has to be seen as one of the great success stories of British government in the mid-19th century. Now, there's a lot of unsuccessful stories of British government, particularly applied to Ireland. When we look at the way the British government or the British authorities in London, in particular, the House of Commons, House of Lords, the whole British establishment handled the famine in Ireland, we can see all sorts of deficiencies and culpabilities or whatever you like in that. But those who managed to get themselves on an assisted boat to Australia, they can thank people like the Land and Emigration Commissioners, whose job it was within the British Colonial Office to organise these voyages.
And several who are very thankful to those landed emigration commissioners whom Richard Reid has just talked about were the girls from Birr Workhouse. Birr local historian Margaret Hogan.
65 girls left Birr, 1849 and 1850. 30 left in the first group. They set out in spring 1849 and they arrived in Adelaide in June. They were very fortunate, actually, that they had left. They were within 3 or 4 days of Adelaide when the cholera epidemic hit Birr. And the workhouse that they had left, Parsonstown Birr Workhouse, had to cater for 3,246 patients in 1 week. Of those, 101 died, 83 of whom were children. So they were very lucky to be away from Birr.
And although the so-called Earl Grey orphan emigration scheme to Australia ended in 1850, this wasn't the end of assisted emigration for many young girls from Irish workhouses to Australia. County Clare historian Frank Taff.
The orphan emigration scheme, when it was stopped by the New South Wales authorities, there was still a demand for a state emigration sponsorship scheme, So we had other people coming from Athy, particularly some years thereafter. And one of those people I've noted and I've written about in the past was Catherine Carroll and her 3 young daughters who left on this state-sponsored emigration scheme in 1857. Her husband had earlier emigrated to America, and she received one letter from him and nothing further, so it assumed that he had died. Never heard from him again. His brother, Ellen's brother-in-law, had emigrated to Australia, and he suggested that they should emigrate as well. So Catherine Carroll plus her 3 daughters, one of whom was 11 years of age, emigrated, and Ellen, who was 11 when she left Athy, subsequently married in Australia. She married the son of a Galway couple by the name of Lyons, and her son was Joseph Lyons, who was the first Labour Prime Minister of Australia in the 1930s.
It's sort of clear that there were other schemes sending out small numbers of people. So clearly there was still workhouse people being supported by the workhouse to get out, etc. But you don't have a mass workhouse scheme. Nothing like that occurs again.
And that mass scheme which historian Richard Reid has just referred to was the so-called Earl Grey scheme, which assisted over 4,000 Irish workhouse girls to leave Ireland for Australia between 1848 and 1850. Of those girls, 60 came from workhouses in my own native County Kildare. So what was the scheme's ultimate legacy? Historian Danny Cusack.
The legacy perhaps was almost the ordinariness of having children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and absorbing them back into Australian society. And they've only really been remembered, specifically as orphan girls, I'd say, in the last decade or so.
Legacy is very hard. I mean, obviously now there are lots of people who are very proud of the fact, when they start looking, we had a young female orphan girl, who came out of Ireland. And that's, I mean, to put no finer point on it, it's almost romantic, because, I mean, if your emigrant was a kind of solid labouring woman from Wiltshire, who just came out to Australia, had a good life and a fine husband. And but here you've got the famine, you've got Ireland, you've got the young, you've got all those kind of, issues. It's a story. It's a big story.
Historian Richard Reid. Here's Margaret Hogan.
I see two legacies. The first, of course, is the hundreds of thousands of descendants. And the second legacy, which is so inspiring, so interesting, so even amusing, is that these descendants are not ashamed of poor or convict ancestors, that they have the most wonderful stories to tell.
Over 4,000 young girls between the ages of 12 and 18 years of age were brought out to Australia under that orphan emigration scheme.
I like to see this as a famine survivor story.
By the standards of the time, it was a well-run emigration scheme. And also there was employment when they got there.
They were giving them an opportunity.
This opportunity to start a new life.
For many of them, it is an opportunity to better themselves.
It's a success story of the mid-19th century in terms of long-distance migration.
The vast majority of them do extremely well.
The majority of them did well for themselves in their new country.
There would be thousands of people in Australia who'd be descended, from these orphan girls.
From hunger and torment and famine's dark cloud, from the workhouse to Australia to live and be proud. 4,000 girls travelled to Australia's far shore, with the Earl Grey scheme's blessing to prosperity's door. From the workhouse to Australia a new life began, taken from starvation by the bold Earl Grey plan. New clothes were arranged for the orphans to wear, a travel box given and a comb for their hair. They travelled to Devon, from Plymouth set sail, for that new world awaiting a famine girl's tale. They were fed and well cared for on that long outward voyage, and when they reached Sydney were quickly employed. Many soon married and children arrived to sweep away sorrow and the famine's dark tide. From the workhouse to Australia a new life began, taken from starvation by the bold Earl Grey plan. That passage to Australia the brave girls soon faced, with a much brighter future and hunger replaced by sunshine and blue skies of that far distant shore. Another life beckoned to close famine's door. They'd never known freedom like that warm haven gave, away from the hunger and death's cold dark grave. They found a bright new world and a happy new day, when society gave them the Australian way. From the workhouse to Australia a new life began, taken from starvation by the bold Earl Grey plan.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.